It started with a storm. Not a violent one, just a steady, soaking rain that turned the dirt of the French countryside soft and restless. The next morning, Marcel Duret, a 3-year-old farmer in the village of Montigny-en-Arouez, spotted something odd as he walked the perimeter of his field. Amid the churned-up earth where his tractor had passed weeks earlier, the storm had peeled away a layer of topsoil, revealing jagged pieces of rusted metal. At first, he thought it might be an old farming implement, buried and forgotten by the previous generation. But the shape was wrong, curved, fuselage-like, and there were rivets. Curious but cautious, he called the local mairie, who in turn contacted regional authorities. By midweek, a small excavation team had arrived. 2 civil protection officers and a military historian from Saint-Quentin stood quietly by as a backhoe peeled away the sod. The mood shifted the moment metal turned to form wings half swallowed by mud, the tail section curled like a sleeping animal. Then the cabin. The diggers stopped. One of them motioned for everyone to step back. What they saw through the shattered canopy stopped time. Inside the cockpit, bones sat where a man once did. A full skeleton, fragile, collapsed slightly inward from decades of weight and silence, still buckled into the pilot's seat, as if waiting for instructions that never came. Leather had long since rotted away, but the rusted frame of a harness remained, wound around the ribs like a final embrace. They covered the site with tarps and tape, though there was no longer any danger. The war was long over, but the ground had remembered, and now it was ready to speak. Word spread quickly. Historians were called. The gendarmerie sealed off the area. Journalists began circling like crows. But inside that cockpit, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows catastrophe. No blood, no movement, just silence and bones, waiting beneath the soil for 77 years. A missing man, rediscovered by accident, in a field that once heard the rumble of engines and the crack of artillery. France had forgotten him, but the earth had not. The fuselage was bent but largely intact, its once gray paint now dulled to a chalky hue beneath layers of rust and moss. Time had been cruel to the landscape, but strangely kind to what lay beneath it. As crews carefully cleared the mud-packed cockpit, the aircraft's identity came into focus. Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's backbone during World War II. One of the most feared fighters of its time. Now, it lay in a shallow grave, a metallic fossil of a war that had long since faded into textbooks and memorial plaques. The cockpit told a different story. Inside, beyond the skeletal remains of the pilot, were relics perfectly preserved in their own strange way. A cracked leather flight helmet sat collapsed in the footwell. A rusted Luger pistol, its barrel still holstered at the pilot's side, a metal canteen, empty. But the most remarkable find was a small satchel wedged beneath the pilot's legs, fused to the flooring by time and corrosion. Inside, wrapped in what remained of waxed cloth, was a personal diary scorched, water-damaged, and brittle with age. The ink had faded, but the script was legible in places. Names, coordinates, the occasional phrase in looping German cursive, and dates March 1944, repeated more than once. Investigators gathered around the wreck with the reverence of archaeologists unearthing a pharaoh's tomb. They photographed, cataloged, and preserved every inch. The dog tags, still on the skeleton's chest, bore a name: Werner, Karl, Lieutenant, the first thread of a life once lived. Forensics confirmed the remains had never been disturbed. No animals. No looters. Just time and soil and silence. This wasn't just a crash site, it was a time capsule, sealed since the final years of the war, untouched by scavengers or decay. The conditions of the soil, the protection of the canopy, and the depth at which the aircraft settled had created an accidental vault, a coffin with wings. As word of the find spread through military history circles, the questions began. Who was Lieutenant Karl Werner? Why had no one found him for 77 years? And what had brought his plane down over a quiet corner of France in the spring of 1944? Answers would come. But first, they had to listen to what the wreckage still had to say. The bones told their own story. Laid out under sterile lights in a forensic lab miles from the crash site, the remains were handled with a mixture of precision and reverence. The skeleton was mostly intact, weathered but preserved hands still curled slightly inward, the spine arched unnaturally from the crash. Forensic anthropologists noted the signs of trauma: shattered ribs, a fractured femur, cranial impact consistent with high-velocity deceleration. But what made them pause wasn't just the body, it was what the body wore. Among the corroded clasps and torn cloth, investigators recovered a set of Luftwaffe-issue pilots' insignia, rank pins, and a rusted identification tag. The tag had corroded at the edges, but its center remained legible enough to reveal a name: Werner Karl Lieutenant, punched into the metal in cold, soldierly precision. It was the first confirmation the man in the cockpit had once lived, breathed, and had a name someone once spoke aloud. But names are not identities. The tag could have been borrowed, mistaken, worn by another. So DNA testing was initiated. A small sample was extracted from the femur, delicate, careful, irreplaceable. Back in Germany, archival researchers dug through military rosters, Luftwaffe flight logs, and handwritten reports from the chaos of 1944. Cross-referenced lists of missing airmen. One name kept appearing: Lieutenant Karl Werner, Luftwaffe, Fighter Wing 27. Declared missing over northern France, the 18th of March 1944. He had been one of thousands. But now he had surfaced, wrapped in silence and soil. As the forensics lab waited on DNA results, the rest of the world caught up. News outlets ran the story: World War II pilot discovered after 77 years. But none could say who he truly was. Not yet. For now, he was still the ghost in the cockpit, a figure stitched into the wreckage, a man between names, one foot in history, the other still buried in mystery. The scientists leaned over his bones like curators of an unfinished portrait, waiting for science and memory to finish the outline. They had found his body. His name was next, and after that they would try to find his story. The spring of 1944 was a season of ghosts. France, divided and bruised, stood in the final months of German occupation. The Vichy regime, by then a hollow shell, watched as Allied forces crept closer from every front. In the skies above the Loire Valley, patrols were constant planes circling like carrion birds over scorched earth. One of them belonged to Lieutenant Karl Werner, a 4-year-old pilot from Stuttgart with 112 hours in the cockpit and a reputation for quiet efficiency. The 18th of March 1944. It was supposed to be a simple recon patrol. Werner's Messerschmitt had taken off from a small Luftwaffe airstrip outside Tours at 0700 hours, part of a 2-man scouting run tasked with monitoring rail activity near Châteauroux. Allied sabotage had become more aggressive. In recent weeks, tracks blown, trains ambushed, supply lines splintered by the hour. The mission was routine, boring even. Werner never returned. His wingman had lost visual contact over the forested hills near Montigny-en-Ariège. The radio crackled, once static, then silence. No distress call, no smoke on the horizon, just a name added to a growing list of the missing. The Luftwaffe logged it as verschollen, lost without trace. No wreckage, no parachute sighted, no Allied report of a downed aircraft. Some believed Werner had defected, fled into the countryside with forged papers. Others whispered he'd been shot down and buried quietly by the resistance. The truth was simpler and crueler. The earth had swallowed him whole. Back in Stuttgart, the news reached his family in the form of a telegram with no body, no grave, no goodbye. His parents grieved in silence. His sister reportedly kept his room untouched for the rest of her life. Karl Werner became a photograph on a mantel, a name in a dusty registry, a question no one could answer, until now. The wreckage buried beneath that quiet French field was more than metal and bones. It was a missing thread in the vast fabric of a global war. A young man with fuel in his tank, orders in his pocket, and the weight of an empire on his shoulders. And for 77 years, not a single soul knew where he'd fallen. The mission that took Lieutenant Karl Werner to his grave was not one history would call heroic. There was no dogfight, no enemy interception, no medals waiting on the other side. It was a courier run, mundane, unglamorous, and solitary. Luftwaffe archives, long buried in Bundesarchiv vaults, confirmed the flight. The 18th of March, 1944. Aircraft, Messerschmitt Bf 109, G6. Departure, Tours, Sorigny Airfield, 0700 hours. Destination, a small outpost near St. Quentin. Cargo, classified documents for Wehrmacht High Command, the kind of flight where nothing is supposed to go wrong. But that morning, everything was wrong. The weather had turned. Cold mist rolled low over the farmland, clinging to the hills like camouflage. Visibility was poor, 1 kilometer at best. The Loire Valley, once a line of gentle rivers and vineyards, had become a corridor of tension. Allied bombing raids had ramped up. Resistance fighters, emboldened and organized, were disrupting German movement almost daily. Bridges destroyed, convoys ambushed, rail lines sabotaged. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, had few pilots left for non-combat assignments. Werner, by all accounts dependable and precise, was dispatched solo. Flight logs showed he kept low, very low. Witnesses described the Bf 109 flying just above the treetops, hugging terrain to avoid radar and ground fire. A dangerous tactic even in good weather. And on that morning, over rural France, it was a gamble. Somewhere northeast of Montigny-en-Arrouaise, the trail goes cold. His final transmission, a brief burst of static, offered no warning, no farewell. It was as if he vanished mid-sentence, mid-flight, mid-life. The Luftwaffe filed him as missing, and within days the front had shifted again. Units retreated. Command posts were abandoned. Paper trails ended in the margins of history. But the map told its own story. Drawing a line from Tours to St. Quentin cuts directly across the farmland where the wreck was found. The coordinates matched. The angle of impact, the orientation of the wreckage, even the embedded compass found near the pilot's ribs, they all pointed to the same truth. Werner never made it. Somewhere between duty and destination, the sky betrayed him. Maybe it was engine failure. Maybe he hit turbulence masked by fog. Or maybe the war below finally reached up and pulled him down. Either way, his final flight ended in silence, buried by time and the soil of a country that had long since moved on. Long before the plane was pulled from the soil, its shadow lived on in whispers. In Montigny-en-Arrouaise and the scattered villages nearby, stories passed between generations, scraps of memory wrapped in folklore. Tales of a German aircraft that screamed low across the valley in the spring of '44, then vanished without a trace. A crash no one ever found, a pilot who disappeared into legend. Jean-Luc Bérat, now 87, remembers what his grandfather told him as a boy. They were standing in the orchard, decades ago, when a sudden thunderclap startled the birds from the trees. That's what it sounded like, his grandfather said. When the sky cracked open that day, he claimed to have heard the engine falter, cough once, then fall silent. But they never found the wreckage. The war moved too fast. By that point in 1944, the German hold on the region was slipping. Resistance networks had become bolder, more organized. Supply lines were under siege. And when things went wrong, especially for the occupiers, records vanished as fast as soldiers did. Locals who witnessed anything were often too afraid to speak, or simply pushed the memory into the background of survival. One farmer claimed his father saw black smoke curling above the trees, just for a moment. Another recalled scavenging for debris days later, but finding only scorched earth and silence. If the plane had crashed, it had been swallowed quickly by terrain, by time, and by the chaos of a retreating army. The Allies advanced within weeks. German positions collapsed. Anything left behind was either salvaged or forgotten. The crash site, if noticed at all, became just another wartime scar fading under layers of moss and harvest. No official search was ever conducted. No one looked for a missing lieutenant from Stuttgart. He was just one of thousands. A ghost among ghosts. And yet the story lingered. Told in kitchens over coffee, passed along with the same solemn tone reserved for lost brothers and bad luck. No one knew his name. No one had seen his face. But they remembered the sound. The final sputter. The way the air seemed to hold its breath. And now, after 77 years, the earth had exhaled. The wreckage was real. The stories were true. The sky had cracked open and someone had fallen through. In a quiet apartment just outside Frankfurt, an email arrived that would crack open a silence held for generations. Clara Wessling, 39, a schoolteacher with a mild curiosity for genealogy, had submitted a DNA sample to a historical ancestry database nearly a year earlier. She'd forgotten about it until the notification pinged her inbox. Potential familial match to World War II remains discovered in northern France. The name listed Lieutenant Karl Werner meant nothing to her at first. But as she read further, a photo appeared. Black and white. A young man in Luftwaffe uniform, lean-jawed, unsmiling, his eyes pulled toward something off camera. The name sparked a memory. Her grandfather had mentioned a cousin once, went missing in the war, never came back, probably ran. Her hands shook as she dialed her mother. The story came in fragments. Werner had been a point of quiet shame in the family, a pilot who vanished in 1944, officially declared missing, unofficially whispered about as a deserter. There was no funeral, no body, just speculation. Her great-grandmother had died believing he'd fled. He was never spoken of, her mother said. Not really. It was like he'd erased himself. But the DNA didn't lie. A week later, Clara was invited to a government facility in Munich, where archivists presented her with a sealed wooden box recovered from her late great-uncle's attic. Inside, a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, dozens of envelopes marked Feldpost, Luftwaffe, military mail. The script was unmistakable tight, hurried German cursive, signed Karl. Addressed to his sister, Elizabeth, Clara's great-grandmother. The letters were haunting. He wrote of flight training in Kassel, of the loneliness of outposts, of boredom between missions. Then, a shift. Mentions of doubt, of decisions made by men who never see the ground, of dreams of the sea, and Stuttgart in spring. The tone was intimate, even poetic, unlike the man in the photo. One letter, dated just weeks before he vanished, read, "Sometimes I wonder what I am doing up there. It no longer feels like defense. It feels like delay. And the sky does not feel like home." Clara read the letters for hours. She didn't cry. She simply listened. This was not a coward. Not a traitor. This was a 4-year-old boy caught between duty and dread. And now, after nearly 8 decades, he had been heard. They found it fused to the floor beneath the pilot's seat, shriveled, blackened around the edges, the leather cover stiffened into a brittle shell. The discovery of the diary sent a ripple through the team. Artifacts like these rarely survive crash impacts, let alone 77 years beneath the earth. The document was rushed to a forensic restoration lab in Paris, where specialists in war-era conservation began the painstaking process of revival. Page by page, word by word, they coaxed the ink from the silence. The entries were sparse dates, followed by fragments of thought, observations, confessions. The tone shifted with each page. In the early entries, Karl Werner wrote like a soldier, Brief notes on weather conditions, aircraft performance, names of comrades, barracks transfers. But somewhere in the middle of the book, the words became heavier, personal. Lines crossed out, pages torn. It is hard to know who is winning anymore, only that we are all losing something. They say we will be remembered, but by whom? Elizabeth dreams of university. She does not know the sky is so empty up close. The diary wasn't long, barely 40 pages, but it bled humanity. Carl was growing disillusioned. He feared becoming a machine in a war that no longer made sense to him. His handwriting grew erratic in the final entries, the lines tilting as if written in turbulence or desperation. I saw smoke on the horizon today. A town burning, not bombed, set by retreating men. We used to call this victory. I no longer know what that means. And then, the final entry smudged, barely legible, but unmistakable in tone. Clouds gathering over France. I do not feel I will return. The forensic team fell silent as they translated those last words aloud. In them was the clarity of someone who knew. Not just that the mission ahead was dangerous, but that the war had already taken something he could not recover. It was not a soldier's farewell. It was a whisper from the edge of knowing. That diary, like his bones, had waited beneath the earth for someone to come looking. And now that they had, it told a simple, staggering truth. Lieutenant Carl Werner had not vanished. He had written himself into the war, and the war, as always, had written back. Once the aircraft had been stabilized and documented on site, it was carefully disassembled and transported to a military aviation facility outside Reims. There, under hangar lights and in the hands of historians, engineers, and forensic analysts, the story beneath the metal began to emerge. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was studied like a crime scene frozen in amber. Every dent, every fracture was read like a sentence from a forgotten paragraph. The first question was obvious. Why did it fall? Initial inspection ruled out direct enemy engagement. There were no signs of shelling, no bullet holes in the fuselage or tail, no scorching from anti-aircraft fire. The wings were sheared at unnatural angles, but impact, not ordnance, had caused it. The most telling detail came from the engine mount. A fracture in the crankshaft housing, consistent with mechanical failure mid-flight. The motor hadn't ceased from damage, it had stopped working altogether. Experts theorized a sudden oil pressure drop or cooling system collapse. A minor malfunction in a peacetime aircraft. A death sentence for a pilot skimming cloud cover alone, in poor weather, over hostile terrain. The crash angle confirmed it. He hadn't fallen straight down, he'd glided. The aircraft struck the ground at a shallow incline, consistent with a forced landing attempt. Trees on the western edge of the field bore scars, bark shredded, limbs broken. He'd clipped the canopy on descent, spun sideways, and buried the nose deep into the wet soil. A few more meters, and he might have made the clearing. But war does not deal in mercy. Inside the wreck, the control stick was jammed forward, flaps partially extended. His hands had still been on the aircraft when it hit. He had fought to land, fought to live. There was no panic in the wreckage, no ejection attempt, no broken canopy. Just a young man trying to coax a dying machine toward Earth, and the Earth, indifferent as always, rising to meet him. He hadn't been shot down. He hadn't deserted. The machine failed, and the sky let him fall. What stunned investigators most wasn't just that the pilot had remained at the controls, but that after 77 years in the ground, he was still there. Intact, undisturbed. A skeleton seated in silence, still clothed in the final moments of his life. The preservation bordered on the miraculous. Experts explained it with science. Upon impact, the cockpit had compressed and sealed like a vault. Mud and debris rushed in, entombing the canopy, creating a natural pressure lock. Oxygen was cut off almost immediately. Without air or exposure to elements, decomposition slowed to a near halt. No animals disturbed the site, there was simply no scent, no access. Time forgot him, because the Earth made it so. When the canopy was finally pried open, a chill passed through the team. There he was, Lieutenant Karl Werner, not in pieces, not scattered, but exactly as he'd died. His boots, cracked and faded, still rested against the rudder pedals. His flight jacket, though stiff and worn thin, clung to the frame of his chest, and on his left hand gloved, curled gently inward, gleamed a sliver of gold, his wedding ring. A simple band, dull from years and darkness, engraved faintly on the inside with two initials, K. WWII, a love story never told. No photos in the cockpit, no letters from home, just this one symbol, worn until the end. It raised questions. None of the family members interviewed had ever mentioned a wife, no record in the Luftwaffe files. Perhaps it was a quiet marriage, a wartime promise made and lost before it could grow old. The ring was removed carefully, catalogued, preserved. The skeleton was lifted in one piece, as if the man within the machine had simply fallen asleep, as if he had waited patiently for someone to come find him. There was no violence here, no gore. Only the strange serenity of a man held still by time and mud, sealed into the cockpit by fate. The war had claimed thousands like him, but most were dust or names on paper. Karl Werner was different. He had not decayed, he had not vanished. He had remained body, name, and memory waiting in the silence beneath a field that had once been sky. The field that had once swallowed Lieutenant Karl Werner now refused to let him go quietly. Within days of the announcement, the story spread across France and Germany. German World War II pilot found after 77 years. Headlines rippled through news sites, radios, history blogs, but it wasn't just journalists who came, it was people. Elderly locals from Montigny-en-Ariège brought bouquets of wildflowers and placed them at the edge of the excavation zone. A child left a paper crane with "Pays" written in block letters. One man knelt in the dirt and whispered something to the wreckage. He wouldn't speak to reporters, said only, "I dreamed of this plane for years." The crowd grew. Not large, this wasn't a battlefield or a national monument, but steady, quiet, respectful. Some stood with arms folded, unsure of how to feel. He was German, after all. Part of an occupying force that had torn through their villages, commandeered their barns, sent their neighbors to camps. But this wasn't a tank or a machine gun. This was a skeleton in a rusted cockpit, wedding ring still on his hand. The war was over. All that was left now was a man. Murmurs passed among visitors. "He was just doing his duty," someone said. "He was young," said another. Some shook their heads, others left candles. The regional council permitted a temporary memorial to be built on the edge of the site. A small wooden post was driven into the earth, mounted with a plaque in both French and German. "Here fell Lieutenant Karl Werner, March 1944. Recovered July 2021. Let the dead speak their names." Archaeologists continued their work under a tent of tarpaulins and camera rigs, but the site had already become something more, not sacred, but solemn. An open wound that had finally been cleaned. The war had left so many stories buried, lost in forests and footnotes. But here, under a sky now calm, one had been unearthed. And the people, French and German alike, stood not for a uniform, not for a flag, but for the fragile truth that time had finally returned to them. As the news settled, something more complicated began to surface, not just bones, not just history, but questions. Questions about memory, forgiveness, and the thin, fraying line between enemy and human. Should a German pilot, once part of an invading force, be memorialized on French soil? Or should the past remain buried, quiet, undisturbed? The debate reached editorial pages, academic panels, town hall meetings. A local veterans group protested the attention given to a soldier of the Reich. A small but vocal group online accused the village of glorifying a Nazi. But others pushed back. The pilot had not bombed civilians. He had not led men into atrocity. He had flown a courier mission, alone, and he had died alone. The village mayor, herself the granddaughter of a resistance fighter, spoke carefully. "This is not an honor guard. This is an act of acknowledgement. War does not erase the human." In a televised interview, Dr. Léon Marchand, a historian from the Sorbonne, framed it simply, "History is not just victory and defeat, it's memory. And memory does not choose sides. It only asks that we listen." It was that perspective that led to something unexpected. At the small primary school in Montigny, teachers used Lieutenant Werner's story as a teaching moment, not about war tactics or dates, but about empathy. About the people war consumes. The children wrote essays, poems. One drew a picture of a plane in the sky with a parachute trailing behind it. Another titled hers, "He Had a Family Too." A week later, the school held a quiet ceremony. No speeches. Just 27 students standing in the courtyard, each holding a single white flower. They placed them in a circle, not just for Lieutenant Werner, but for everyone lost to that war. German, French, Allied, resistance, civilian, known and unnamed. In that gesture, the soil turned again, this time not with wreckage, but with meaning. The past had not been rewritten, but for a moment it had been reconciled, not by politicians, not by generals, but by children, flowers, and the quiet weight of remembrance. The day they flew Lieutenant Karl Werner home, the skies over Picardy were clear. No fanfare, no grand procession, just a military transport plane rising quietly into the morning blue, carrying a casket draped not in flags but in dignity. Inside it, the skeletal remains of a man once believed, lost now named, now known, now going home. In Stuttgart, the burial was private. No cameras, no speeches beyond the families. The cemetery rested on a quiet slope on the city's edge, rows of weathered stones bearing the names of sons and fathers taken by the war. Karl's grave had already been prepared next to his parents, who died long ago without ever knowing where he fell. Their headstones were simple, edged with moss. The casket was lowered with precision. A chaplain offered a blessing, neither political nor patriotic, just human. And then Clara Wessling, his great-niece, stepped forward. She held the letters, the dog tag, and the wedding ring. "He did not disappear," she said. "He waited for us to find him. And now we have." There were no salutes, just silence, a breeze stirring through the trees, a bird overhead, the kind of quiet ending that war rarely gives. After the burial, Clara placed the ring back inside the small wooden box that had once held his letters. Not to bury it, to keep it. A symbol of something unfinished, perhaps unknowable. A life lost, but not erased. In death, Karl Werner was no longer a question mark in a military file. He was a name in stone, a face in a photograph, a man with a final resting place, and the long echo of his vanishing had finally come to rest. Even now, with the plane recovered and the body laid to rest, the earth does not let go easily. Europe is a continent stitched with unmarked graves. In forests, fields, and rivers, the remains of the Second World War still sleep beneath layers of time and silence. Some are soldiers, others are civilians. Some wore uniforms, others carried only bread and papers and hope. Karl Werner was just one of tens of thousands listed as missing, presumed dead. His story, though remarkable, is not unique. Historians estimate over 1.2 million combatants remain unaccounted for from World War. 2 men lost on both sides of the front. British pilots in French marshes, Soviet conscripts in Polish woods, Americans beneath Italian farmlands. Germans, like Karl, scattered across a continent they helped set ablaze. Most will never be found. But sometimes the land decides to speak. A shift in the earth, a scrap of fabric, a bone long hidden, catching light after decades in the dark. Sometimes it takes a flood, or a storm, or the curious glance of a farmer in a field. And when that happens, the past resurfaces not as history, but as humanity. The field where Carl's plane was found has since been plowed, the soil turned over, the trenches filled, the excavation sealed. Crops will grow again, seasons will pass, but not everything is erased. Near the edge of the tree line, beneath a small oak, stands a stone, weatherproofed, unadorned, barely knee-high. Chiseled into its face, Lieutenant Carl Werner, found 77 years later. No rank, no cause, just his name and the time it took to come home, because the land keeps its secrets, but it does not forget. In war, statistics blur the faces. Battles are measured in numbers, in units lost and ground gained, in territory surrendered and cities consumed. But behind every uniform, every faded photograph, there is a name, a voice, a set of eyes looking skyward. And sometimes, when the earth is ready, it returns them to us not just as remains, but as reminders. Lieutenant Carl Werner was not a famous figure. He didn't win medals or alter the course of history. He flew a courier mission on a day the war barely noticed. He didn't survive it. He didn't return home. He vanished, like so many did, into the soil of a foreign country, under a sky he could no longer trust. And yet he was found, not because someone knew where to look, but because time and chance conspired to give him back. A rusted wing exposed by rain, a dog tag beneath mud, a wedding ring still clasped in a glove. The story of a man once lost to silence, unearthed piece by science, by memory, by care. His bones were just the beginning. What followed was something deeper. The letters in an attic, the diary beneath the seat, the quiet mourning of a niece who never knew him. A war that once devoured everything in its path had, after 77 years, offered up something gentle, a small measure of peace. Carl Werner is home now. His grave is marked, his name remembered. His story, once erased, has been written again, not by generals or governments, but by archaeologists, farmers, historians, and family. By those who believe that remembrance is an act of justice, even when the war is long over. And perhaps that is how history truly heals, not by rewriting what happened, but by giving voice to those it silenced. In war, lives are lost, but sometimes, decades later, they are found again, not just the bones, but the stories, the people, the truths. The screen fades to black as the camera pulls back past the oak tree, past the stone, past the field now seeded with spring crops. The wind moves gently through the grass. In the distance, birds rise from the trees, and beyond them, the sky vast, quiet, and whole again. The same sky that once cracked open. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.